All right, today we are very excited to be speaking with Dr. Wes Youngberg. Dr. Wes Youngberg is a practicing clinical nutritionist and lifestyle medicine specialist in Temecula, California. He was trained at Loma Linda University, where he earned a doctorate in clinical preventative care and a master's degree in nutrition. He's on the clinical faculty at Loma Linda University and serves as the assistant clinical professor for both the Department of Preventative Medicine and the School of Medicine and the Department of Health Promotion and the School of Public at the School of Public Health. So he's lectured to medical conferences throughout Europe, throughout Asia, and the Americas. His passion is the full integration of both physical and emotional risk factors in the assessment and the intervention of health. He's published several books, including The Path to Health and Healing, Goodbye Diabetes, and most recently, Hello Healthy. So thanks so much for being with us here today, Dr. Youngberg.
It's great to be with both of you guys. You have a great conference lineup today.
Great. Yeah, it's really an honor to be speaking with you. So your book, Goodbye Diabetes, is an absolute goldmine. There's so much nuanced information that you cover in there. It's really valuable. So we're going to try and address a lot of that today. But why don't you just give us a little bit of a background? Like, where did you start? How'd you get into this? How'd you get digging deep into the diabetes world? Just, general background.
Well, it was interesting. I was watching your video just recently, Rowdy, about your work with Dr. James Anderson, or at least as you discovered his work. And that's exactly how I got passionate and excited about reversing diabetes. I was actually a student at Loma Linda University in my professional training, and he came for a spring seminar series talking about reversing diabetes. And for those who don't know Dr. James Anderson, he was the premier researcher showing that you could reverse diabetes all the way back in the 70s and 80s. And so he was speaking to a large audience at Loma Linda University, showing that you could reverse diabetes, and I'd never heard that before. And so I just became the evangelist for reversing diabetes at that point.
That's great. So you went on to do some work in Guam. Why don't you tell us about the work you did in Guam?
Well, in 1994, I had the privilege to take my whole family to Guam, and basically right in the middle of the Micronesian Islands. And we were planning to be there for 6 years, heading up a lifestyle medicine center and providing these type of programs to help reverse diabetes on the islands. But I loved it so much that I ended up staying 14 years. And during that time, the governor of Guam actually asked me to co-chair a task force on reversing and preventing diabetes on Guam. Guam has a death rate of diabetes 5 times higher than the U.S. mainland. So it was a huge issue for the island, and that's where we came up with a lot of the stories and the case studies that I review in my book, Goodbye Diabetes.
This is great. Okay, so you have a lot of really good information about the common and uncommon tests used for assessing diabetes health. So let's start with the glucose tolerance test, because that's something that I think a lot of people with diabetes are aware of, but not necessarily very many people actually have it done. So in your book, you say that the glucose tolerance test is the most accurate and comprehensive test available for determining a predisposition for prediabetes or diabetes. So can you kind of give some insight into what this test is and why it's actually so useful?
Yeah, it's kind of fallen out of use, conventionally speaking, especially in 1997, when the criteria for diagnosing diabetes dropped from a fasting blood sugar of 140 to 127, precisely because they were recognizing that the complications of diabetes were actually occurring before the diagnosis was made. Because the complications were created by blood sugars that were far lower than what would be required to diagnose the disease. So that was a kind of crazy, cart before the horse scenario. And so a lot of the researchers and clinicians did at the time is they thought, well, now that we have a more sensitive standard, we don't need to hassle the patient with doing a glucose tolerance test. The problem was that wasn't a good decision, in my opinion, because even now, the most sensitive test for for catching early pre-diabetes or diabetes, or as you suggested, a predisposition to it, is the glucose tolerance test. The most sensitive glucose measure for determining our sensitivity is the 1 hour level. And even the current standard for the glucose tolerance test omits the 1 hour. You get a fasting, you get a 2 hour. So that's why on my lab forms for my patients, I specify we get the half hour and the 1 hour, and then I take it a step further to check the third and the fourth hour to see how resistant they are to insulin, how long that hyperglycemia, that high blood sugar remains after that 75-gram sugar drink. And for many patients, whether that blood sugar drops off into hypoglycemia. A third of my patients are actually hypoglycemic. They have adrenal fatigue scenarios. And so that test becomes one of the most fundamental tests to look at a three-dimensional view of our metabolism. What's happening, how quickly does the blood sugar spike? How long does it remain elevated? Does the blood sugar then cause a big slump or a drop-off to hypoglycemia? And then what I do is I measure the fasting 1 hour and 2 hour insulin production by our own pancreas. And that actually is the most sensitive test for figuring out predisposition to not only diabetes or pre-diabetes, but also Alzheimer's risk, cardiovascular risk, autoimmune risk. It's a wonderful test to assess, because I have a lot of patients that have perfect fasting blood sugars, perfect after meal blood sugars, but their insulin levels are 10 times too high. And so that becomes the canary in the mine, so to speak, to catch things early. So that's why I like to do the glucose tolerance test.
So in the glucose tolerance test, individual comes to your clinic and then they drink a 75-gram solution, a solution containing 75 grams of sugar. Is that right? White table sugar?
That's right. Well, it's actually glucose. It's pure glucose. And some people who, for whatever reason, don't want to do that, which is the current standard, I give them the option to eat real food or to eat whatever they're used to eating to see what the impact would be comparable to, every day of their lives. The other thing to note here is that typically, if you look at the American Diabetes Association website and other similar websites, they'll say that there's 26 million Americans currently with type 2 diabetes. But if you add a glucose tolerance test to that mix, in other words, you add a 2 hour after glucola or glucose load blood sugar, that number is increased by 14 million. It's actually over 40 million people who have type 2 diabetes in the United States alone. And so you can see why there's so many people around that have just recently been tested by their doctor. They've gotten a fasting glucose in the metabolic profile. They may have even gotten a hemoglobin A1C, which is becoming more and more common as a screening tool. But both of those tests are woefully inadequate compared to a 2 hour blood sugar. Okay, and so they're told, hey, you're good. You're not pre-diabetic. You're certainly not diabetic, when in fact they could actually have diabetes.
Okay, so if an individual doesn't have you as their doctor, let's say they're living in the middle of the country, and they say to their doctor, hey, I'd like to get a glucose tolerance test. And if their doctor does say, okay, this is something that's useful, they don't get that 1 hour measurement. They might get a fasting and a 2 hour and a 4 hour, and maybe they don't even get the insulin measurement. So is there any other way, rather than working specifically with you, where people can get this information and find out what both their their glucose and their insulin levels really are?
Well, there's more and more information on this on the internet. Well, one way is that I have patients will frequently give my book to their doctor, and they say, hey, if you're really interested in my health, check out this information on the lab section, and would you be willing to work with me and order some of these tests? So that's one option. Another option, half of my patients I do by Skype or FaceTime all over the country or even internationally. So if people are not able to find any help, they can actually work directly with me or somebody like me that provides that online service.
That's terrific. And so it's great to hear you say that you let people do real food on the test. So theoretically, somebody could, just for fun, do it at home. They could eat maybe enough bananas or something to add up to 75 grams of carbs, and they could test their blood glucose.
That's right. In fact, so there's a standardized method, which is the pure glucose. That would be comparable to a small soda. No, that's not true. A medium soda at a theater, for instance. Once we understand their sensitivity to junk food, right? Okay, then we can opt for a whole food tolerance test to see how well they handle just straight 75 grams of for instance, fruit juice.
Got it. Okay. And while we're talking about measuring insulin levels, I heard in one of your lectures online, you talk a lot about how much insulin levels are an indicator of lots of diseases. So there's a strong connection between, like you said, breast cancer. Like, how important is it to really make sure you're on top of your insulin levels?
I first heard about the connection between insulin levels and breast cancer from Dr. Nancy Bohannon, and one of my colleagues who was a aging expert, a family physician who was a gerontologist. And she told me, she says, Wes, the higher the fasting insulin levels, the higher the risk of breast cancer. And I go like, what would that have to do with breast cancer? So like any good clinician and researcher, I went to the research and I started, and this was all the way back in 1990, and I actually found 700 separate studies showing the association between elevated fasting insulin levels and breast cancer. And finally I said, okay, I get it. I don't need any more studies. There's a huge relationship here. And as you pointed out, the relationship is with most common cancers. In fact, we've known for over 45 years in the scientific literature that when your insulin levels are higher, either because you're producing a lot of insulin to compensate for your internal resistance to insulin at the muscle and liver level, or you are basically using extra insulin injections to compensate for a bad lifestyle, right? If you just say, well, I'll just eat whatever I want, I'll just take more insulin. Okay, and that's, by the way, one way that a type 1 diabetic can actually also become a type 2, because they are now on top of the type 1 diabetes, they have all the manifestations of a type 2 diabetic, and now they add together, and that dramatically increases the risk of complications.
Okay, and before we move on to the next topic, I want to keep on going on this insulin one, because this is a big deal. We didn't say exactly the diet that you advocate. So you're telling people that they can get to a low level of insulin, an appropriate level of insulin, right, eating foods that potatoes, rice, some fruit, beans, legumes, stuff like that. And that's your experience. Just want to make sure that's clear.
Absolutely. When somebody, see, unfortunately, the big focus in medical care up to date has been on just controlling blood sugars any way you can. And so they'll use oral medications or extra insulin for the type 2 diabetic to just get a better blood sugar level or better A1C. Problem is, the recent studies done out of Mayo Clinic are showing that the more you do that, the higher the risk of microvascular complications and macrovascular complications. Your risk of heart attacks and strokes, it all goes up when you try to just control it with more medication. So the answer is go whole food. The number one strategy to improve our health is not just trying to lower the blood sugar through any means possible, but to start eating 100% plant-based foods, and all of a sudden your body responds to that and begins healing. You're getting to that tipping point where the body can actually heal and improve.
So you yourself are vegan, is that correct?
That's right.
And how long have you been a vegan for?
Well, I grew up vegetarian. My parents were vegetarians, and but then when I was 24 years old, I was in my professional training program, and one of my classmates was a med tech as well. And so she said, Wes, why don't you come get your lipid profile done? So I said, sure, man, I'm Mr. Health. I'm sure it's like 140, 150 at the most, right? Because I knew what the ranges should be. And this is 1984 when the cholesterol education program first came out. Prior to that, cholesterol up to 320 was considered normal, right? And so I had my cholesterol checked, and 2 days later, she came back with a piece of paper looking kind of worried, and I thought she was just busting my chops, like messing with me. And she said, Wes, your cholesterol's kind of high. I go, come on, Lori. And then I looked at the paper and I was shocked. My cholesterol was 244. So being vegetarian, meaning, enjoying the cheeses and the dairy products and the desserts associated with that and the eggs, etc., clearly wasn't working for me, right? And so I did a 6-week research project on myself, and I could modulate my cholesterol 90 points either way by just going between a healthy vegetarian diet and a healthy vegan diet.
Wow, that's fantastic. So now when you get your fasting lipid panel, what are the...
Yeah, so I keep mine, consistently under 180. That's my goal.
That's great. Okay, so we talked about the glucose tolerance test and why it's such an important test in determining not only your risk for diabetes, but also your risk for cancer and all the other complications that come along with diabetes. When it comes to the C-peptide test, that's another very valuable test for really understanding what your total insulin production is. So can you go into a little detail about what is the C-peptide test and why is it so important?
Okay, well, most doctors will use a C-peptide test to verify with a patient, is this patient a type 2 diabetic that's using a lot of insulin, kind of brittle, or are they really a type 1 diabetic? So really, type 1 diabetes is denoted primarily by the inability of the pancreas, the beta cells of the pancreas, to produce insulin, any measurable amount of insulin. And so the problem with measuring insulin to determine the body's ability to make insulin is that the type 1 diabetics are using insulin and injecting it. And so you don't know whether you're measuring the injectable insulin or the amount that the body's making. So a C-peptide test is a way to measure the insulin producing capacity of the pancreas without being complicated with the insulin measurement. So anytime I have a question about that, I will measure the C-peptide fasting, and there are standards on the lab that tell us whether or not that puts them into a type 1 diabetes or a type 2 diabetes scenario. Now, the way I like to use the C-peptide for the average diabetic, type 2 diabetic, is I do a 1-hour stimulated C-peptide where they eat 75 grams of carbs to increase the blood sugars, and then we check the C-peptide level 1 hour later. And so presumably if your blood sugar goes up, your pancreas should be stimulated to produce more C-peptide and insulin. And if that level is less than 2, that means that there's an estimated only 5% chance that person would be able to regain dramatic function of the pancreas, at least in a 3 to 6 month time span. And therefore, we are able to counsel them of what to expect on the program. We're preventing complications, we're doing all the important things, but they may still need some insulin in the future. But if they're between 2 and 4, it's a 50-50. If they're above 4, it's a 95% chance that they could reverse this and not need any medications whatsoever within a 3-month period. And guess what? Almost everybody I test is above 4. Even though their blood sugars may be running 300 and 400. They're still above 4, which means that their pancreas has not reached that point of serious failure. They're in a fatigue mode. They're burning out their pancreas, their ability to make insulin, but they still have the capacity to produce enough insulin to control blood sugars naturally.
Right, this is great. So let's talk a little bit about that capacity. So some people talk about the idea that the pancreas doesn't need to function at 100% for most people or type 2 diabetic, to get back to have regular blood glucose numbers.
Right.
So what percent of the pancreas, how much function of the pancreas does one need to have acceptable?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because I have heard good friends of mine that are endocrinologists that have been done their PhD and their MD degree in diabetology. The standard, the conventional wisdom out there is that even before somebody is fully diagnosed with prediabetes, or right there around that borderline pre-diabetic level, that the pancreas has already decreased its functionality of being able to produce insulin by 60%. Now that is initially gives the impression that it's hopeless, right? That, that's kind of promoted in that way. It's like, oh man, if even by the time you're pre-diabetic, you've lost 60% of your functionality of producing insulin, then what hope is there for diabetics? But the reality is that functionality can come back. And especially because we are recognizing that functionality is related even to low-grade infections in the pancreas that produce an amyloid plaque in the pancreas. And this is pretty amazing that we are now able to call type 2 diabetes Alzheimer's of the pancreas.
Ooh,
just like Alzheimer's is now being referred to as type 3 diabetes of the brain. And so what's really cool is that I'm even working with early Alzheimer's patients, helping them reverse their Alzheimer's using the very same strategies we use to reverse type 2 diabetes, because it's essentially a similar disease just in a different part of the body.
This is one of my favorite subjects of all time. When I first read about the fact that Alzheimer's disease could be termed insulin resistance of the brain or type 3 diabetes, it was a light bulb went off in my head.
Right.
So if we go into a little bit of detail here about what exactly is Alzheimer's disease and how is it similar to the type 2 diabetes in your pancreas?
Well, so the one connection I just mentioned is that there's been studies showing for a long time that when you can actually measure this amylin or this amyloid plaque, that's a close cousin to the amyloid, to the beta amyloid that builds up in the brain associated with cognitive decline in Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. And so that's one connection. So that what's really interesting here to understand and not to confuse the listeners is that beta amyloid and amylin are actually a part of an innate immune response. In other words, if you didn't have this response, you would probably die of meningitis, okay, in terms of brain function, and the pancreas would probably get shut down. So in other words, we need to ask the question, why is the body using this innate immune response in this way, and what can we learn about that mechanism? And so that's why it's so critical that people understand the value of the 100% whole plant-based diet beyond its impact on blood sugars, because that is really the way to optimize the precursors that minimize the body's production of things that can lead to damage to the beta cells in the pancreas, their ability to make insulin, or damage the neurons in the brain, the memory cells in the hippocampus of the brain that then lead to Alzheimer's disease. So one interesting mechanistic point here is that there's an enzyme in the brain and in the body. It's called IDE, insulin degrading enzyme. And this enzyme, when I measure insulin levels, the insulin level almost is always the highest at the 1 hour, but by the second hour, many times it goes from super high to optimal. Okay, so what happened? How could that insulin drop so quickly from such a high number? And the answer is the body is producing a lot, is allowing this insulin degrading enzyme to break it down quickly to prevent rapid hypoglycemia and coma, right? So it's a critical, but here's the point. Insulin degrading enzyme also degrades beta amyloid plaque in the brain. And so if you're spending all your time degrading all this excess insulin that we're producing, trying to compensate for the high blood sugars due to the insulin resistance, then we're essentially shifting the focus on controlling insulin, and beta amyloid goes out of control and the brain deteriorates from that, memory goes out. So those are several of the mechanisms that are similar mechanisms that involve both type 2 diabetes and type 3 diabetes, Alzheimer's in general.
So this is great. So if we're understanding you properly here, what you're saying is that if you go from 100% normal functionality, 100% insulin secretion capacity, all the way down to 40%, so you've lost 60% of your insulin production, at that point we're technically termed a type 2 a person with type 2 diabetes, but yet that's still enough insulin to keep your blood glucose in the normal range, as long as you're eating a low-fat, plant-based whole foods diet. Correct?
If you're following the lifestyle strategies, all the things that impact and help reverse or resist insulin resistance, then even if you only have a 20% capacity left of producing insulin, that's still enough. Okay, for instance, okay, somebody has perfect insulin sensitivity or optimal because they exercise regularly, because they're eating the right diet. Okay, they don't need that 100% reserve capacity. They just need a little bit, right? And so you can have optimal blood sugars all day long, all year long, for the rest of your life if you just maintain the right lifestyle, even if you have lost 80% of your capacity, in theory. So that's the good news for these individuals.
Okay, so you have a chart in your book about these 5 stages of high blood sugar.
Right.
So let's just have you talk through that a little bit and how that relates to people who are living with type 2 diabetes. And then we'll go on and we'll talk about how that would relate for people with type 1 diabetes.
Okay, so on page 90 of my book, Goodbye Diabetes, I have this chart of the 5 stages of hyperglycemia or high blood sugar. And this chart was first developed when I was working closely with Dr. Charles Brenniger, who was the leading diabetologist at Loma Linda University for decades. And he decided to come out to Guam for 3 years and spend 3 years on the island helping us research diabetes and put together an awesome diabetes center. And so we were asked to head up this task force for the governor to deal with diabetes on Guam. It was just out of control. It was just horrendous. And so I remember saying to Dr. Brenner, I says, how are we going to prevent diabetes on Guam when the current standards of testing don't even pick it up until you've already had complications for 5 to 10 years? Right? And so that's why we realized we had to come up with some earlier stages of hyperglycemia, of high blood sugars that happened before the diagnosis. And so by definition and by design, rather, the 3rd stage of high blood sugar is the beginning of prediabetes. In other words, there's 2 stages of high blood sugar that come even before prediabetes. Okay, and then there's another 2 stages that work up to the diagnosis of diabetes. Now that would be true to whether we're talking about type 1 or type 2, because it's just a diagnostic value. Clearly, though, we have different criteria for somebody who's diagnosed with type 2 diabetes versus type 1 diabetes in terms of how aggressive we want to be. We're not trying to get people down to optimal if they're type 1 diabetes in terms of that stage, because they could easily become hypoglycemic, and that would be far more dangerous than having a high blood sugar. In other words, what's more important than blood sugars in a type 1 diabetic or even a type 2 diabetic is what you're eating and what your lifestyle is. The programmatic aspect of what we choose to do is far more important than how high your blood sugars are. Now, I'm not discounting blood sugars. I'm just saying focus on the most important things. Follow the program and then get the benefits from the program, irrespective of the impact on blood sugars. And so on even a type 2 diabetic, Rowdy, what happens is that they may be on a lot of medicines. And so we have to, on day 1, help them, working with their primary care physician or whoever is prescribing that medicine, to get on a sliding scale so they can start adjusting that medicine day 1. So if I were to get the one cautionary note to all your listeners, the thousands of people right now listening to this, getting excited about, hey, man, maybe there is hope. Maybe I really can reverse this. Maybe if I'm a type 1 diabetic, I can prevent all those complications and optimize my blood sugars further. If I'm a type 2 diabetic, there's a really good chance I could reverse this if I know what I'm doing. But the number 1 risk is blood sugars dropping too fast because they hesitate to adjust their medications. And so I can't emphasize that enough. In our Diabetes Undone program, we say that in the beginning of every single class. You need to be checking your blood sugars before and after meals. And as soon as you start seeing a shift in the right direction, you need to be working with your doctor to cut back that medication. Because if you don't, you will end up in the ER and you may actually die. So you got to be on top of it. You got to know what your numbers are. And that's exciting. When people say, are you serious? Now they have a reason to check. Previously, they say, why should I check? Nothing changes. It's always bad. So they stop checking. Now we have a reason to check because it's going to show you, it's going to demonstrate to you how powerful 100% plant-based diet is when you're adding in also after meal light activity, things like that, that just plummet those blood sugars.
So this is phenomenal because we see this all the time in our coaching program as well. In your experience, how quickly do people see a need to reduce their medication, whether it's oral medication or injectable insulin?
You know, there's a lot of my colleagues that immediately cut medications in half on day one, okay, and many times cut it out altogether if they're a part of a program where monitoring is easily done. So if somebody is working, you know, long distance through working with a coach or whatever, they just need to be checking their blood sugars and basically put their prescribing physician on notice. I am now in a program that will dramatically alter my blood sugar levels. I need to know how to adjust my medicines. You need to tell me that information. And my physician colleagues who are the first to admit, we are great at putting people on medications, but we're horrible at helping people come off, especially diabetes medications, because the concept out there is that, well, no, the expectation is that we're just gonna have to keep increased medication dose, add more and more medications. That's expected. Of course it's expected. If you're not addressing the causes of the problem, then sure, you know, we're gonna need more medication. But if you address the causes, day one, you need to start making adjustments, but you know by checking. So that's why I always tell my patients for the first 2 days, don't change anything. Keep eating the same old, whatever diet you've been eating. Don't change anything. Just check your blood sugars before, 1 hour, and 2 hours after the beginning of the meal. Track that. Get numbers for everything and just write out what you're eating. Then I tell them, don't even change anything about your diet. All you do is just add after meal exercise. I'm talking about just walking, just something light, and see the impact of after meal exercise. And we can talk about that later if you want. And then add the 100% plant-based diet or gradations of that if you're struggling. Okay, but they always need to know what's best, right? Then once they apply the best, they see this dramatic transformation in their blood sugars, and then they're sold. It's like, wow, you know, I would have never believed this if I hadn't actually looked at the contrast between what my after meal blood sugars were on my normal diet and what they are now when I'm following this good evidence-based, scientific, best medicine available today program.
This is awesome. Let's talk about this in a little more detail. So in the 5 stages of high blood glucose numbers at optimal, in the optimal range, you have somebody about an hour after they ate, 119 or less. I just want to talk about that a little bit, that you see people that this is real, this happens, people eat, you know, these foods you're talking about, whether that's potatoes or beans or fruit, rice, they see those things and their blood glucose, a healthy person, is not going above 120, correct?
Right. So if somebody is truly metabolically healthy, which let's be clear, very few Americans are metabolically healthy, very few. So, and this is in a nutshell, if you're between the ages of 40 and 59, 1 out of 2 of us already have at least prediabetes. That's at least stage 3, high blood sugars or higher. If you're between the ages of 60 and 74, it's 2 out of 3 of us. Okay, and if you're above age 75, it's 3 out of 4. So that's prediabetes, right? And so if prediabetes is the norm, just imagine what insulin resistance is. So my estimates are that anywhere between 80 and 90% of Americans are insulin resistant, okay, at some level. Okay, and we can measure that by looking at a glucose tolerance test, measuring insulin levels. Okay, and so the key here is understanding that if all we have to check is the blood sugar, the 1 hour blood sugar is the most sensitive. And so you can still be insulin resistant and have a perfect 1 hour blood sugar, but most Americans have a 1 hour blood sugar after they've consumed sugar that's way above 120. Okay? In fact, they have a perfect fasting sugar, a perfect 2-hour sugar, but the 1-hour sugar may be as high as 200. I see that all the time.
Got it. Okay. So now for people living with type 1 diabetes that adopt this lifestyle, what would you expect a good 1-hour blood glucose to be after having one of these meals?
Well, I think the key to focus on in a type 1 diabetic is to run the numbers like I suggested earlier, where you're actually checking your blood sugars after what you normally do, before a meal, 1 hour after the beginning of the meal, and then 2 hours after the beginning of the meal. And do that before and after every meal for a couple days so you get a pattern. You see what your pattern is. And then when you start adding in the light exercise after meals, when you start adding in the appropriate diet, you start adding in appropriate rest and all the other factors that come into a comprehensive lifestyle medicine approach, then you'll see how dramatic that changes. And a type 1 diabetic will typically have to cut their insulin down by 40 to 50% or more. I know that you're an expert at that more than I am. You do it every day, right? So I should be asking you that question. But as you know, everybody's a little bit different. And the key is remembering that many type 2 many type 1 diabetics, not like yourselves, they actually have a form of type 2 on top of it. They are horribly insulin resistant. And if you're taking more than 30 units of insulin a day, that strongly suggests that you're insulin resistant in some way. It may not be because you're overweight. It may be because there's a low-grade infection. It may be because of stress. It may be because of other inflammatory markers going on. But so we need to ask the question, what are the things that are driving that insulin resistance and how to combat that?
Can you go back to what you said? You said if you're using more than, I think it was 30 units of insulin per day, then
that's a rough estimate typically. And again, there's many factors that come into this, but we would normally say that a typical healthy individual, their pancreas needs to produce somewhere between 20 and 30 units of insulin a day, and it may be less than that. And so that correlation then goes to a type 1 diabetic. They're truly metabolically healthy. They don't have inflammatory problems or stress problems or other issues that are driving insulin resistance up. Then we're trying to limit the total amount of excess insulin required. Why? Because insulin is, as a growth factor, tends to promote many cancers and other potential problems. So it's only excess insulin that does that, by the way. It's not, I want to make that very clear. So I don't get demoralized if you're a type 1 diabetic and you're going, oh man, I'm really messed up now. I'm going to get cancer just because I'm injecting insulin. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if I've had friends of mine, type 1 diabetics, that say, hey, I'm they call themselves Dr. Dose, says, I know what to do. I'll get that mocha latte, drink that down. And I just crank up my pump and give myself a whole bunch of more insulin. And then my blood sugars are okay, right? But at what cost? All that extra insulin is now potentially putting them at risk for things that they would have never dreamt about. And so they just need to know about that. And so that's why what you guys are doing and putting on this program and have this amazing cast of presenters, if even half of what is being presented is applied, we're dramatically altering not only the risk of the typical complications of diabetes, but the less known complications, cancer, other autoimmune diseases, and heart disease, and so forth.
I'm actually glad you hit on this link between excess insulin and cancer, because there's a lot of people in the type 1 diabetes community that will eat a low carbohydrate diet specifically to bring their total insulin use down to as close to zero as possible. And their methodology is, well, the less insulin I use, the lower my risk for cancer. Even though what you're saying here and what we also try and advocate is that there's a fundamental difference between your physiologically normal amount of insulin secretion versus an excess insulin use. So I'm really glad to hear you say that it's the excess insulin use that's increasing your risk for cancer and other related diseases. and it's not your physiologically normal amount of insulin that's actually causing that problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And to take off on that point specifically, we know, for instance, that one of the main complications of diabetes, of high blood sugars, is advancing chronic kidney disease. And so the individuals that buy into this logic of bringing in more meat products as a way to, in their thinking, optimize the diet, to optimize insulin resistance in their thinking, they're actually dramatically increasing other risk factors, and the risk-benefit ratio is going way the wrong direction when they do that. We know there's no question, there's no argument that one of the number one contributors to progressing chronic kidney disease and to end-stage renal failure is meat of any kind. White meat, red meat, any kind of meat dramatically increases risk of progression by like 300% or more. Okay, and so what's the whole point of controlling blood sugars if now you're actually leading to end-stage chronic kidney disease, which increases your risk of Alzheimer's 500%, increases your risk of a heart attack between 300 and 500%. I mean, let's focus on things that are logical and make sense. And so going with the meat protein, horrible idea, even based on the current research.
Yeah, this is really important. I'm glad you're talking about this because, look, a lot of people, especially in the type 1 community, but the type 2 as well, you're looking on the internet, you're looking into alternative solutions, and everybody knows the standard ADA guide is not going to get any special results. So in the alternative community, you're looking, okay, do I do low carb or do I do low fat? Like both camps have success stories, have people losing weight, have good A1Cs.
Right.
So it's important that I'm glad you're touching on this topic. So you're saying, so even if somebody, let's say they were a type 1 and they start doing like a very low carb diet, like less than 30 grams of carbs a day, they need a small amount of total insulin. It's because they're not eating any carbs. Their blood glucose curve is actually quite flat. What do you say to people who are doing that or considering that?
Well, again, this is really a question of logic. And so, for instance, an analogy to this would be people saying, well, if I just drink a lot of alcoholic beverages, I'll get my HDL up, right? The good cholesterol goes up. Yeah, well, you can do that by eating pesticides too. So the reality is that when HDL goes up, that means the body is recognizing there's a problem and doing something about it. Okay, and so the answer isn't to put all our eggs, so to speak, in one basket and focus on a good A1C and a good blood sugar level. That can be accomplished very effectively with 100% plant-based diet when done properly, right? But as I mentioned earlier, the Mayo Clinic study that came out last September showed that if you focus on improved blood sugars in A1C exclusively, that actually increases death rate. It increases the stroke risk, heart attack risk dramatically, and it increases the common complications of diabetes, especially kidney failure. And so let's make sure that we're controlling the A1C and controlling the blood sugars in the right way. And that's why I'm so excited to be part of this summit, because you're talking about doing it in a way that gives you that serendipity effect. Everything else improves, not just blood sugars and A1C.
Yeah, I think this is a really important topic, actually, because in the world of diabetes, I think what a lot of people do is they chase biomarkers. Mm-hmm. They chase glucose. They chase insulin use. And what they're saying is, as long as I can keep my glucose and insulin in a good range, problem solved. But in reality, what you're saying here, and what we also advocate here, is that there's 1,000 other things that you need to take into account. And that if you're achieving a low insulin use and a stable blood glucose value, but you're eating in a way that's actually increasing your risk for cancer, heart disease, autoimmune disease, hypertension, mm-hmm. Then you run into, you're actually trading diseases. You're saying, okay, here's my diabetes, now give me 3 other conditions in return.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. The trade-off is a bad trade-off. So let's make sure that if we're going to put a lot of effort into improving our health, that it doesn't actually backfire on us. And so the strategies that are being outlined in this summit are the strategies that across the board improve health. That's what I love about lifestyle medicine.
And something you touched on several times today, which I think is really important, I want people to hear from you, is this idea of light exercise after meals. So what's your experience and recommendations with that?
By the way, there are now studies demonstrated this impact specifically, but back in the early 1990s, Dr. Horinucci and other colleagues of mine, we put together this 6-month-long intensive program for patients on the island of Guam. And so we started checking blood sugars before, 1 hour and 2 hours after every meal for the first 2 weeks of the program to see what was going on. And what we discovered was that when we did light to moderate exercise immediately after the meal, we would, because we tabulated this for years, so we have all the data, we would get anywhere between a 1 to 3 point drop in blood sugars per minute used with light exercise. So for instance, if you start out with a blood sugar of 200 before the meal, and then 1 hour after that meal, let's say your blood sugar's at 250. You could actually drop that blood sugar with 20 minutes of exercise. You could drop that blood sugar, instead of being 250, it's now 190, just because of the exercise. And then, of course, if you add on the right nutrition with that meal, it's like transformation. People get it, and now they're willing to put the effort on the diet. They're willing to put their effort on being active immediately after meals, not get sweaty, not get huffy and puffy, not get tired, just light. You're just going out walking or doing something as simple as raising the arms above their heads. And, this has been demonstrated in gestational diabetes for 30 years now. You do 20 minutes of sitting on a chair doing this after every meal, you can lower your blood sugars 100 points at the 1 hour mark, from diabetic to perfect in just 6 weeks.
Now, here's a question. How does that compare to exercising before a meal? Do you know the difference between before versus after?
Actually, research has looked at that. And of course, exercise done appropriately is good at any time, right? So we don't want to discourage people from doing exercise at a time when they can't do it. But if somebody has the option to do it either right before or right afterwards, it is actually best to do it immediately after that meal is complete. And I tell them, don't do the dishes, just get out there. And so my mother, who, was always pushing for all the men to help clean the kitchen after the meal, she said, no, we got to clean the kitchen first. And I said, Mom, if you go walking with us, we'll have more energy so we can help you clean the kitchen. We won't feel like sitting on the couch. So absolutely, right after the meal is best, and optimally a little bit before and after, if you have the time.
Great. Okay, so in your book, you have an entire chapter on vitamin D. So can you talk to us about why vitamin D is so important?
Wow, yeah. I was... again, I was sitting in my back porch on Guam, watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, facing towards Japan and other islands. And I read this article in the lifestyle section about a Harvard physician who had done a meta-analysis on the level of vitamin D in the blood and the risk of cancer. And it blew me away when he said that the risk of developing cancer is higher amongst those with a low blood vitamin D level than it is for those who smoke cigarettes. And I remember, I'm certified with 2 international agencies to help people stop smoking. And that was like, a blasphemy. It's like, well, wait a minute. How could just vitamin D levels be more important in terms of cancer mortality than whether you smoke or not? And so I checked that out closely, and I discovered that the same statistics that were used to determine risk of smoking mortality was used in this case with vitamin D. So bottom line is this. At that very week, I started testing everybody for their blood vitamin D levels. Now remember, I'm sitting on the island of Guam, right near the equator. I'm thinking, well, in Guam, nobody's going to have a vitamin D deficiency, not the sunshine vitamin. I mean, the sun shines every day of the year on Guam, right? And guess what? 80 to 90% of my patients were deficient in vitamin D. Okay? And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is age. We don't synthesize vitamin D out of cholesterol in our skin as we get older very effectively. Another reason is we're taking showers all the time. So what do you do when you're in the sun for an afternoon? You know, if you're out, you know, exercising in the sun, first thing we do is jump in the shower, soak down, and guess what? Vitamin D down the drain, because it's a fat soluble vitamin that's still not absorbed into the bloodstream. And it takes up to 48 hours for that to fully absorb. And so for a lot of reasons, we are deficient in vitamin D, especially in the wintertime. For those who live above the 37th parallel, which is, you know, more than half of people in the United States, they get, even if they're in the sun all day long, they get 0 vitamin D for 5 months of the winter. So,
okay.
So in other words, there's a powerful association with low vitamin D levels in the blood with both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. In fact, studies have shown that if children are vitamin D replete, 80 to 90% of type 1 diabetes would be eliminated. Big study in Finland. So that speaks to autoimmunity in general, by the way. So I spent 7 years doing a gestational diabetes clinic every Wednesday morning when I was working in Guam. And there's 2 things that I made sure that my patients were pregnant who had gestational diabetes or impaired glucose tolerance. Not only that I make sure that they were exercising properly and eating properly, but I made sure that we optimized their vitamin D levels, number 1, and number 2, that we optimized their essential fatty acid levels, okay? Because those are the typical deficiencies found in most people, irrespective of their diet.
So let's go back to what you said. You said there's a 70% association between low vitamin D and type 1 diabetes. Is that right?
Actually, the studies initially said 90% was preventable if there was at least 2,000 units of vitamin E per day consumed from birth on up through age 10. But if you crunch the numbers into a multivariate analysis, it's more like 80%.
Okay, great. So 2 questions then for you. What is considered a low vitamin D status? If somebody were to go get a blood test, what is the number? What is the threshold by which they would say, okay, now I need to improve this vitamin D?
Most labs, go ahead, sorry.
Okay, and then number 2 is if somebody's following a plant-based whole foods diet, are there any foods that they can eat that can actually boost their vitamin D status?
Okay, so number 1, shiitake mushrooms. Okay, shiitake mushroom, if you eat like a steak, a shiitake mushroom steak, you can get about 1,500 units of vitamin D from that. Typically, the sources of vitamin D are not plant-based. They are like fish-based or liver-based, milk-based. The dairy industry likes to push the fact that milk is fortified with vitamin D, but you would literally have to drink like 4 gallons of milk a day to get any substantial amount of vitamin D, clinically speaking. Of course, that would be a very, very, very bad idea. So I don't recommend dairy to anybody. And I certainly don't recommend the liver to anybody for all the toxins that liver carries. And I don't recommend fish to anybody because of all the toxins and other problems associated with that. So the answer is in terms of labs, when you get your 25 hydroxy vitamin D measured, the lab range typically is between 30 and 100 nanograms per milliliter. Okay, and so the key here is that at minimum you want to be in what they call the normal range. And as you well know, normal ranges are a far cry from optimal ranges. A normal range for cholesterol technically is 130 to 320. You don't want to have a normal cholesterol. You don't want to be anywhere near the upper half of a normal cholesterol reference range. And so that's why, some years ago, 20 years ago, they changed it from a normal reference range to a clinical reference range. Most labs, however, don't use a clinical reference range. They use a statistical reference range. And so that's why the chapter in my book, Goodbye Diabetes, and the chapter in my book, Hello Healthy, all have like 40 pages on what the best labs are, and not just the normals, but what's an optimal for that. Okay, and so bottom line is we want it above 50. So we got to get the vitamin D status above 50, and that's for all of us, regardless of any other factors.
Now, one thing that you see a lot on the internet is that people say, okay, great, if I can eat shiitake mushrooms, great, that's a good source of vitamin D. However, there's a lot of people on the opposite side of things who say, no, 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 no. Plant vitamin D is vitamin D2.
Right.
Animal vitamin D is vitamin D3. Therefore, and the two of them have different biological functions. And so if I were to eat shiitake mushrooms and get the vitamin D2, that doesn't have nearly the potency or effectiveness as vitamin D3 from animal foods. Is that a true statement or not?
Well, we're getting into technicalities now. I think here's the bottom line. Whether you get vitamin D2 or D3, you're going to improve your vitamin D status, period. Okay. And so now what's interesting is you can actually get a vitamin D3 that's vegan. The number one vitamin I recommend to my patients for vitamin D is a vegan D3. And what happens is they take the ergocalciferol, the vitamin D2, and they just molecularly modify it to vitamin D3. So you have a natural D2 that has been modified into a bioidentical D3. So that's the one that I recommend so that we can technically get the best of both worlds. But what I don't recommend is taking a huge dose of D2 just once a week or once a month. That could be potentially a problem with people who have liver issues or other problems, because now the body has to convert that massive dose of D2 into D3. It can do that. Most of the time it doesn't matter, but in some cases it's just putting extra work on a system that's already tasked.
Okay, this is great. Now, just so our listeners, we'd like to ask everybody we're talking to give a quick summary, like an elevator pitch. So for people living with diabetes, what is the diet you recommend they follow?
Okay, the bottom line is that if you follow a diet and it ultimately makes you worse in some other way, you're not going to keep doing it. So the best diet that gives you what we call the serendipity effect, where everything tends to get better, is 100% plant-based diet, where you're eating real food. I love the fact that you just got back from buying produce, right? That is, if you're not shopping, in the periphery of the grocery store, if you're not getting 90% of your food from there, then you're going to have a challenge. Okay, so I talk about what's called green light foods, yellow light foods, red light foods, or we can call them first class, second class, third class foods. If you want to have first class health, you got to eat first class foods. At least 80-90% of the foods need to come from that section. Okay, and then second class foods are not are still plant-based, but they've been processed in some way. So you want to eat at home. You want to bring that food into your home and eat whole food. And whole foods are loaded with gene-altering phytonutrients. These are the pigments in these colorful plant-based foods are literally chemicals that change the genes, that turn off the bad genes and turn on the good genes. So if you're doing that, if you're following the instruction of what the summit is promoting, you will literally be changing the expression of your genes to that tipping point of healing. So I wish you success as you contemplate this, as you now have hope in what is possible in reversing diabetes and preventing complications. Just follow the steps. Don't focus on the numbers right away. Follow the steps and you will be successful.
Dr. Youngberg, I feel like over the last hour, you just became my new best friend. So
hey, you too, man. This is great.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today, because there's so many people with diabetes, whether it's type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes, gestational diabetes, who are looking for healthier ways to be. And you giving us this idea that, a whole food plant-based approach is really the most important and the most effective method for reversing insulin resistance and regaining normal health is such a powerful message. I really appreciate all the work that you put in over your career leading up to, this summit here today.
Thanks for having me.